Thank you so much for joining us, Allegra. We're really excited for this presentation.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to share the stories of the women who have shaped Olana into what it is today, from its origins in the 19th century all the way through the story of how Olana became a state historic site and a public park and museum in the mid-20th century. Olana, from the moment you walk in, from the moment you drive in off the road, is introduced to us as the home of Frederic Church, the masterwork of Frederic Church, a 250-acre designed landscape, eclectic, architecturally diverse country house at the height of it all, panoramic views, all shaped according to Frederic Church's master vision, master plan. And as one of the preeminent American painters of the 19th century, certainly the preeminent, most internationally known and successful landscape painter, Frederic Church's name has a lot of clout for us, especially us art historians. But today I want to take some time to shift our lens and look at the women who have always been so crucial to Olana. We're going to have a little bit of a tour through time, meeting many of the women of the Church family, starting with Frederic Church's wife, Isabel Carnes, and the crucial role that she played in the design and development of Olana, especially its house and collections. We're going to meet many of the trailblazing women who were friends of Isabel and Frederic, who visited Olana from their international travels and exchanged ideas and contributed to the intellectual and social life of this place. And finally, moving into the 20th century, we're going to meet the daughter and daughter-in-law of Frederic and Isabel, and the crucial role that they played in preserving the memory of Olana as it made the transition from a family home to a museum and public park. So going back to the very beginning, Olana, starting in 1860, began developing into what we recognize it today, with the purchase of a 126-acre working farm by the newly married Frederic Church. He had just met Isabel Mortimer Carnes in New York City. So we're going to meet her and look into what her life was like, what she brought to her partnership with Frederic, and what all of that meant for Olana when it came time to create, especially the house that I'm currently sitting in now. Isabel was born in Paris. Her father, Francis Carnes, was an importer. He and his brother ran a business importing especially goods from the Far East, from Japan and China, to European and American consumer markets. Francis was much older. He was born in 1786. Isabel's father born in 1786. And his second wife was Isabel's mother, Emma Carnes. She's shown here in a charcoal portrait. This is her later on in life in 1888, around the time that she would have been a frequent fixture here at Olana. But in 1836, Isabel was born in Paris. She spoke fluent French. She was brought up in a very cosmopolitan atmosphere in her young life. But very quickly, when Isabel was young, her family moved from Paris to Dayton, Ohio. And that was where Isabel spent most of her childhood. We have this one rather grainy, I'm afraid, daguerreotype of Isabel. She's the eldest on our left, looking at the screen here, leaning on the table with books, with two of her younger siblings. This would have been her in her early tween years in Ohio. We know a little bit about Isabel's childhood. She did take art lessons. She was certainly exposed to global consumer goods through her family's business. And her mother and father had been in Paris quite socially well connected. We have a scrapbook in the collection that Emma Carnes assembled that has calling cards from all sorts of luminaries and letters and invitations. Apparently, Isabel's father was quite chummy with the Marquis de Lafayette, just to give you a bit of an idea of her background. And the Carnes family had relatives in New York City. And that was what ultimately brought Isabel and Frederic together. Isabel was visiting New York City with her mother in 1859. She was about 23, Frederic 33. He had just debuted The Heart of the Andes, which was really the pinnacle artwork of his career, what really cemented his fame. And according to one account, there are several conflicting versions of this family story. Isabel was in the crowd at one of the exhibitions, one of the receptions around Heart of the Andes, and Frederic spotted her. There's an alternate version of the story that Isabel had seen the Heart of the Andes, didn't meet Frederic at the exhibition, but expressed a desire to meet the artist, and they ran into each other later at the theater or the opera. So there are a few, family history versions of this meeting, but in any case, Isabel certainly did see the Heart of the Andes, and this was her introduction to Frederic in 1859. So they were engaged within the year. We don't know too much about really what happened with their courtship, but 1860, they were married, and Frederic did not have a home at this point, and Isabel, of course, would be expected to move into and begin setting up a household as a married woman. So Frederic purchased the farm here that would grow into Olana, 126 acres, and they moved into Cozy Cottage, which still stands today, their first home here on the property. Right away, we see Isabel becoming the central figure of the artist's personal life and a constant companion for him in his travels from here on out. Isabel had, up to this point, lived with her family from Paris to Ohio in little journeys with her mother. Frederic, as a single man in his late 20s and 30s, had traveled already to South America twice. He went to Newfoundland and Labrador right before his marriage to Isabel. So you can see a bit of an uneven footing in terms of, exposure and independence in the world quite typically, but Isabel immediately stepped into this role of the traveling companion. And we have little glimpses seeing her becoming perhaps even more adventurous, more willing to be out braving the elements than Frederic. I just love this cartoon from possibly their first trip together as a married couple, their sort of pseudo honeymoon to Mount Desert Island in 1860. They went again later in 1862, and we don't have a precise date, but this is quite early on in Isabel and Frederick's marriage. A sketch that Frederic did of Isabel perched up on this cliff gazing out at the harbor. Apparently it looks quite windy, maybe a little rainy. In the caption, I'll do the little readout for you in case it's not quite legible, but Frederic has captioned this little sketch. Time 2 hours past dinner time. Isabel says, "Oh, Fred, isn't it grand? I feel as if I never wish to go away." Frederic, teeth chattering, "Yes, very." So Isabel was quite active in the travels and the social connections that made Olana into, this salon, this beacon that it would ultimately become. Of course, Isabel was the household manager. She was the mother of the family. Frederic and Isabel had 6 children. Their first 2, Herbert and Emma, did die of diphtheria at quite a young age, and then 4 children were raised to adulthood here at Olana. Just a few charming snapshots here to get us into the family life behind the scenes here at Olana. On the left, this is Emma Carnes, Isabel's mother, holding her first grandson. This is Herbert, less than a year old, possibly, a christening portrait kind of situation here. And then later on at Olana, we have Isabel with her daughter Downey, who we'll meet in a little bit more depth later on. Isabel and Downey are on the right here, sitting on the steps of the main house at Olana with a few of their friends. So Isabel's role was the family manager, the social manager. She managed the staff of primarily women who made Olana run. Young single women, often Irish immigrants, who were the waitresses and the maids of all work. The cook, Jane McKenna, she was a quite central part of the operation of Olana and crucial. But Isabel was responsible for managing all of the behind the scenes mechanisms of this place. More so than that, though, we have little glimpses, and this is an area that I think more research is always due, and we can just start to put together an idea of how much Isabel, her own artistic interests, her own image as a global traveler, her own family connections even, how much of that shaped the global atmosphere, the global collections, the intellectual life of Olana and the main house here. Isabel clearly did have an interest in collecting. She and Frederic together amassed a remarkable eclectic collection here at Olana, most of which survive still in the main house, that reflect their interests, spanning the continents, spanning centuries, different media, from natural history specimens to fine European paintings to Middle Eastern brasswork and armor, Chinese and Japanese ceramics and scrolls, Middle Eastern textiles. The list just goes on and on of what they accumulated here. And Isabel had some part in that, definitely in the hands-on acquisition. We know for sure that she was an avid plant collector, so some of that natural historical impulse to have specimens of things. Just shown here, we have 2 pages of a massive herbarium of ferns that she assembled in Jamaica in the summer of 1865. And there are more plants and plant albums that Isabel created in the Olana collection, all very, very fragile and unfortunately never on view, but we fortunately have a few images showing these arrangements of plants that Isabel was collecting and creating. She definitely came into her own, I think, as a collector during the 2-year sojourn that she and Frederic took to Europe and the Middle East, 1867 to 69. This snapshot of her on a donkey with her 3rd child, the infant Frederic Joseph Church, looking just absolutely delighted in her lap there, shows Isabel in Beirut. Isabel spent quite a bit of time independent of Frederic in Beirut especially, and in Rome. There were a few times when Frederic went off on his own little sketching expeditions. In Beirut, it was so he could go by camel to the ancient city of Petra off in the desert. And Isabel stayed in Beirut with her child, with her mother who was with her, and with friends that they had met abroad. And Isabel spent time exploring. She made purchases. We know she was buying and sourcing materials, especially rugs and textiles, it looks like. In her diaries, she records her impressions of the architecture and the kinds of decorative artwork and ornament that she and Frederic were absorbing in Beirut and Damascus, most notably. And we see her really processing what she loves about these interiors. And she is actively buying pieces that probably are still in the Olana collection today, if not actively in the main house. We may just not know exactly what it was that she made an independent purchase of. And later on, towards the end of their trip, Isabel again spent some time in Rome with her mother and now 2 infants. She gave birth to their 4th child, Theodore Winthrop, in Rome, and Frederic went off to Athens, not immediately, a little while after that. He made a trip off to Athens to sketch the Parthenon, and Isabel had time to be fully immersed in the artistic milieu of Rome, and again, to soak up what she loved, what she didn't like about architecture and art, as the couple were turning their thoughts back to the Hudson River, to their property, and what they ultimately wanted to create here at Olana. So coming back from this trip in 1869, Frederic and Isabel had already acquired the property at the top of the hill here at Olana. They'd expanded out from that farm, and they knew that they wanted to create a grander country house, moving up and out of Cozy Cottage. By 1872, the house was constructed enough that they were able to move into the 2nd floor, and then interior decorating and the development of the 1st floor continued for years thereafter. The record primarily shows Frederic Church working with his consulting architect, Calvert Vaux, in the development of the main house. We have clearly his, watercolor sketches and pattern sheets trying out different elements, designing down to the barest detail the house. But there are a few tantalizing hints that invite us to open up our minds more to how much Isabel was looking over his shoulder, what she was pointing into, what conversations might they have had as they were creating this interior. Isabel's daughter, Downey, again, after her parents' death, wrote to their friend Charles Dudley Warner, who was writing a biography of Frederic primarily. And to paraphrase, says, you know, can my mother's great part in Papa's life be brought in? She says, in the house, her taste is shown from top to bottom. Her advice was asked about everything. There's another little hint from another friend, Marianne North. Again, we will meet her in a little bit. She visited the churches several times. And when she came to see the house and hear about the whole process of creating the house and its decoration, North wrote that it was Isabel, it was Mrs. Church, who had arranged what she calls the entire collection of curiosities to form this house. So again, just a few hints like that, that in combination with Isabel's background, her early exposure to the decorative arts, to the globalizing market of importing goods like what we have at Olana, and of course that engagement that we see, that thought process that we see in her diary while traveling, I think it is completely fair to say that Isabel's taste is demonstrated at Olana, that she had an enormous influence on its ultimate design. Just showing you here as we're talking about all of this, very familiar to those of us here at Olana, the court hall, the central space of the home that reflects the global interests of the collection, has some of the richest stenciling and polychromy, and architecturally very much reflects the sort of open-aired atrium with the grand staircase, the filtered amber light, all of these elements that Isabel was noting in her diary while traveling abroad. On the left here is the earliest visual record we have of that space. It's an unfinished, clearly, painting by a student of Frederic Church's, Walter Launt Palmer, showing the space, and Isabel is seen just starting to ascend the stairs there, looking back at one of her children. And of course, it's an unfinished painting, but I just feel this almost ghostly presence that she has filled in at the center of the court hall here is a wonderfully apt demonstration of what we know and we don't know about Isabel's crucial role as a designer, as a collector, and what she really brought to Olana as a complete work of art. So with that little background about Isabel, switching gears slightly, now that the house has been built, the Church family has this magnificent global collection. They have a very enviable library of books on all sorts of subjects. They have prints and photographs. This is a real intellectual repository that they have created. And it's a grand house with a beautiful landscape and miles of roads. Who is coming to Olana? And who made it into this sort of vibrant social hub that we know today. Many of the visitors to Olana, I would say a notably high number, were women, many of them single women, world travelers, published writers, accomplished artists, and they were attracted to Olana definitely for this global collection that was here, for the social life that Frederic and Isabel fostered. We're just going to go through and meet three major figures. Footnote, of course, there are many more women who show up in the archives at Olana, who could all, I'm sure, be PowerPoints of their own. But we're going to meet three of the figures who really left a mark through their contributions to Olana. We're going to start with Susan Hale, who was a frequent visitor and friend of the Church family. We don't know exactly how they met, but she starts showing up in the mid to late 1880s. Susan Hale is part of a large Boston, I would say, art family. She, her siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews, uncles, aunts, they all seem to have a hand either in the literary world or in education or in the arts. Susan herself is an author. She's a traveler. She writes numerous travel narratives about her journeys. And she is also an artist and art teacher. Her collection is mostly preserved, not in really the public eye, but in a repository at Smith College, my alma mater. So thank you to Smith for graciously sharing some images from your Susan Hale family archive with us here at Olana. Susan wrote, among her many travel narratives, art instructive books. One example here is specifically targeted at women who are looking to gain self-taught really art skills at home, knowing that women were often excluded from, the art academy, the sort of formal training that was expected to become a professional artist. Susan herself did primarily exhibit in watercolor. And in Boston, she seemed to have gained some significant traction with her watercolor paintings. I have yet to track down any of her finished exhibited paintings. If anyone knows, please let us know. We would love to know more about Susan Hale's art career. But what we do have from her archive at Smith are some of these more personal reference level sketches of landscapes, of people in the landscape, many botanicals, interestingly. As we'll see as we get into some of these other female artists in the Olana orbit, botanicals were a subject that was almost prescribed for women to tackle as artists, as amateur artists in particular. Wouldn't require the strenuous hiking of the landscape, doesn't require the anatomical study of history painting or portraiture. Botanicals were really associated with femininity and as being an appropriate subject for women to learn. And there are many stories in and outside of the Olana orbit of women who took this stricture and turned it into a fabulous career, pushing the boundaries of the medium. This example here of Susan Hale, it airs more certainly on the conventional side of a watercolor botanical study. But this was the type of practice that she imparted on women interested in art through her books that could be distributed far and wide, and by the in-person art that she taught in Boston, where she had a home on the Common. She never married, remained independent throughout her life. One woman who was influenced by Susan Hale was Ellen Day Hale. Ellen Day Hale is Susan Hale's niece. And she is one of the major Boston Impressionist painters of the latter half of the 19th century. I just wanted to pause and show this fabulous self-portrait that many of you may recognize from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Ellen likely had early art instruction from her Aunt Susan. And between Susan and the other forceful women in her family, I mean, we can just see that influence coming out in her powerful, assured self-portrait. So I think the echoes of Susan Hale and her role as an art teacher are felt now more in the art historical canon than perhaps Susan's paintings, her personal works. But coming to Olana, Susan Hale was a fixture of the social life here. She wrote really colorful, gossipy, juicy letters about who she met at Olana, what went on here. She also traveled with the family to Mexico in the 1880s. And then later on, this is another trip that I would encourage anyone to research more about and tell us more. Later on in the 1890s, she accompanied Isabel to Algeria, along with one of Isabel's sons, Louis. But they went to Algeria while Frederic spent a winter separately in Mexico. So Susan was definitely one of the close companions, traveling companions, frequent, almost every summer visitors to Olana. And she partook in the vibrant social life here. She participated in the sort of little entertainments, plays, tableaux vivants that the churches and their visitors would put on here at Olana. She was out exploring the landscape. Just here she is on the far right of this group shot. Looks like mostly younger people she's with here at Olana for Thanksgiving of 1892. And then just to give you a better shot of her, this is Susan Hale later on in the 19th century at her home in Matunic, Rhode Island, where she was also a fixture of more of an artist colony there. But it seems wherever Susan went, whether she was at Olana, in Boston, at Matunic, or traveling, she was just a social magnet, absolutely beloved, witty, and her letters really evidence that and the crucial role that she played wherever she went. And for Olana today, Susan is honestly one of our most referred to primary sources just because of the richness of her correspondence, how astute her observations were and her reading of people. She gives us just such a rich window into the social life of Olana. So moving on, pivoting on from Susan Hale, Amelia Edwards, definitely a friend of the Church family. She was British, based in London. When the Churches met her, she was based in London, I should say. Later on, she was in Bristol for quite a while. Primarily known as an Egyptologist, Amelia Edwards is nicknamed the godmother of Egyptology for her role in founding the Egyptian Exploration Society in the UK, one of the first professional organizations that was dedicated to this budding interest in ancient Egypt. But Amelia was quite a polymath. She was an artist and a writer of both fiction and travel narratives and archaeological texts, many of which she self-illustrated. This is just a snapshot from the Olana collection from our library right here in the main house of Amelia's now most renowned work, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, which is a really foundational text on Egyptology and accounts for her archaeological expeditions, her activity in Egypt, and her work really applying scientific rigor to this field of Egyptology. This copy is inscribed to Frederic Church. She unfortunately misspelled his name. We have a stray K at the end there, a common error for those on more of the outskirts of the social circle. But Amelia Edwards and the Churches crossed paths in London while the Churches were on their way into that 2-year 1867 to 69 European trip. And evidently they must have kept in touch, or at least on the periphery, because in 1890, or it's the winter of 1889 into 90, over Christmas and the New Year, Amelia Edwards comes to Olana. She is on a lecture tour of the US. She made a living later on in her life doing these sorts of lectures on a circuit. And her trip to the US was a pretty big deal, you know, celebrity, well received. And for the winter holidays, she stopped over at Olana with her companion, Kate Bradbury, who I have just one picture here. Bradbury was also in the Egyptology zone in the circle, a bit younger than Amelia, and they were for a long time very close associates and traveling companions. So to get into the loaded term of traveling companion, Amelia Edwards, clearly in the record, revolved her entire emotional life around other women. She was never married or engaged, and she cohabited closely with women throughout her life. There are a few archival records, one letter in particular that she wrote to her friend John Addington Symonds, and then Symonds writing on, passing on his impression of Amelia and her life and her relationships. She is certainly someone who today we would apply the term lesbian. She was completely oriented towards women in her social and personal life, and was, I would say, more open about it to her friends than we might expect would be possible in the 19th century. She was truly trailblazing. And her grave, which she shares with her longest running companion, Ellen Brasher, they were together and cohabited for nearly 30 years, is a designated landmark of LGBT history in the UK. So again, this is something that I think the fields of both, you know, social history, Egyptology, art history, literary history, all of these areas that Amelia Edwards touched is starting to catch on to and see how crucial Amelia's relationships with other women were to her entire career and her life. But her legacy is felt most strongly, of course, in the field of Egyptology, where she's nicknamed the godmother. She was a founding member, contributed much of the collection of the Petrie Museum of Archaeology at the University College London. So there's a lovely neoclassical bust of Amelia at that Petrie Museum. And I think Amelia certainly had an influence on Olana with her literary contributions. The library is full of her books, both her fiction and her travel narratives, and that fantastic Egyptological text. And she was likely also one of the real, introductions for Frederic and Isabel to Egypt, and that budding interest that's been called Egyptomania in the 19th century for ancient Egypt, its art and its architecture. And we see those little glimmers of interest in Egypt and its archaeology throughout Olana. The churches themselves did not make it any farther than Alexandria. There was thought of them going further up the Nile, like Amelia herself did when they were on that trip, but held back for logistical primarily reasons, I understand. But certainly their fascination with Egypt could only have been encouraged and helped by Amelia and her enormous role in the field. So last figure we're going to meet in this little phase is Marianne North, another of these British-born, world-traveling, never married women who, in her case, left a huge mark on the field of botany and biology. And Marianne North was a two-time visitor of Olana, once when the churches were still down at the farm in Cozy Cottage, and then later on that second trip, once the main house had been built, when she made that revealing comment about Isabel and her role in the decoration and design of the house. So Marianne was a world traveler, and she was propelled by the desire to see plant life everywhere in her life. And I should note, she really didn't start doing this until middle age. After her father died, she took the fortune that she inherited and turned it towards her travels. And she seems to have done so primarily independently, much as Frederic Church would have as a single young artist, carrying letters of introduction to meet and connect with local dignitaries who could house her and orient her to where she was in the world. And wherever Marianne went, she was painting. She, by the end of her life, had gone and painted on every continent that had plant life. So we're discounting Antarctica. But other than that, she truly strode the entire globe. And along the way, kept journals and letters that she later worked up into an autobiography, which is in the collection here at Olana. And here we have just a few images of Marianne at work. She did paint with oil in the field. We have her here at her easel in South Africa under some enormous cacti. And then above here, this is a photograph taken at the home of Julia Margaret Cameron, the famous British Victorian photographer in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Cameron took a series of Marianne, both these sort of staged, the artist at work shots, and more typical fare for Cameron, sort of pre-Raphaelite looking, very airy, ethereal portraits of Marianne North. But wherever Marianne North went, she was connecting with fascinating people, a lot of British expats. I mean, her story of world travel is really the story of the British Empire and its ability to create this network and bring back all of its riches to the home of Britain. And ultimately, that is what Marianne did. She self-funded a gallery at the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Kew Gardens in London, which still stands today. One can visit today. And it contains her entire breadth of work, arranged geographically to, again, show the plant life of the globe, i.e. the British Empire. The paneling, just a fun tidbit, the paneling under Marianne's paintings are all composed of wood samples that Marianne brought back from the corresponding places where she was painting. So there are physical, natural specimens and evidence of this plant life, along with her impressions of it through her painting. There is some of Marianne's artwork in the Olana collection. There's a very small sketch of a bird of paradise that has been more tentatively attributed to Marianne North, but this one is more firm. Correspondence with the Kew Gardens, who are really the global Marianne North experts, helped us to identify this painting that Marianne would have done in Jamaica, that evidently she gifted, left with the Church family. It is currently on view in the main house in the studio. The pelican flower, one of these sort of bizarre exotic plants that seem to be most Marianne's taste. She writes in her autobiography about this plant really with relish that it smells absolutely evil. It's one of these sort of corpse smelling plants. And she seemed to have a real taste for these oddballs of the plant world. She, in her travels, identified several species of pitcher plant, which is a type of carnivorous plant. And there are a handful of species, I've lost the number off the top of my head, but a handful of species of pitcher plant that are named after her, have Northiana in their scientific name. So again, she left a real mark on the field of botany. And here at Olana, she brought back stories of these global travels. She left her artwork here clearly, and gifted a set of shell beads from Madagascar to the churches, which are hiding in the court hall today. If you're very familiar with Olana, one of the strings of beads that are sort of draped elegantly over ceramic pots arranged around the court hall, one of those is from Madagascar. That was a gift from Marianne North. So this was Olana in the 19th century. What happened next? Frederic and Isabel Church died. Isabel dies in 1899. Frederic dies in 1900. What happened between then and now that allowed Olana to become a museum, become a public site, a public park, a national historic landmark? Many of the crucial figures in the preservation of Olana and really the recording of its history, of its stories, are women. So we're going to turn our attention now to that next generation of Olana after 1900. Starting with Frederic and Isabel's daughter, nicknamed Downy. Isabel Charlotte was her name, named after her mother and aunt. But there are so many Isabels in the family. We call her by her nickname Downy to keep her straight in our minds. So Downy primarily grew up here at Olana, had this childhood really immersed in the landscape and the art and the social life of this place. She met all of the women that we just went over: Susan Hale, Marianne North, Amelia Edwards, all of them either in Downy's own recollections or in their own interacted with her. So she had some really fantastic role models in coming into her own, who she wanted to be, what she wanted to do. And she was definitely an outdoorsy person. We have this great image of her out on a donkey cart with her grandmother. That's Emma Carnes, Isabel's mother, with her out enjoying one of Olana's carriage roads. And as a child, she participated in all sorts of collecting. We have in the Olana collection a massive chest of birds' eggs that were amassed by Isabel, her brothers, and some of their other friends. And it came with this logbook, just showing the entry, the title page here, watercolored up. And she's listed IC Church there as an active member of this DOS mystery acronym society that were collecting birds' eggs here at Olana. Downy, by the time she was an older teenager, was fascinated with botanical painting, of the type perhaps that Susan Hale would have been imparting through her books and her teaching. This sort of borderline of science and art. We have over 100 of Downy's paintings in the Olana collection. And these are two examples of Downy at age 19 at Olana painting the wildflowers that she found here on site. And she continued doing this throughout her life. We have in the collection going up through the 1930s when Downey is traveling to Puerto Rico and Alaska, the homes that she developed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and cultivated fabulous gardens. She really kept up with the botanical painting, but it was always a private, personal hobby. She didn't turn to any commercial exhibiting that the record shows that we know of. And Downey, in her diaries and her recollection of Olana, in her keeping of objects from Olana, really helps us to understand the story of this place. One wonderful example is this quilt that she created in 1901 to 1902. It is currently on view for the first time ever in our current exhibition Afterglow at Olana through the end of October. So you can come and see this quilt in person that Downey created primarily out of her mother's clothing after her mother's passing. But as an artist, she had that sensibility for the creation of color and pattern. She wants more variety in the pieces that she's bringing into this quilt. So she gets other scraps from her sisters-in-law, from her own closet too, I believe, and creates these perfectly balanced patches. All of this is hand sewn, by the way. Downey was a really talented embroiderer, quilter, textile artist. And the entire process of creating this memory quilt, this collective women's memory quilt specifically, is recorded in her diary. Downey's memories of Olana help us to shape, especially the women's lives here. Downey inherited paintings specifically out of her mother's bedroom upon her parents' deaths. She wanted to keep that recollection of the space, the time that she spent with her mother at Olana. So really, Downey's inheritance and what she writes about getting in her diary is our only knowledge of what Isabel's bedroom looked like, and has helped us to reconstruct it today. Finally, Sally Goodchurch, Sarah Baker Good, who married Frederic and Isabel's youngest son, Louis. Sally was the last family resident to live at Olana, and she holds the record for the longest tenure here of anyone. She lived here from her marriage to Louis in 1900 until her death in 1964. So longer than Isabel, longer than Frederic. Sally brought Olana into the 20th century, and really remarkably, did not change much. Certainly some modernizations were made. Louis had the house electrified in 1917. There was a bit of retouching and renovation, especially in more the private quarters, but we understand that Sally knew and appreciated what Olana was as this record of Frederic and Isabel Church, their lives, their interests, their career. And she took that, stewardship quite seriously. And throughout her 60+ years at Olana, changed very, very little about the first floor, didn't go on, a great yard sailing, antiquing adventure to get rid of her her in-laws' old things. On the contrary, she was quite strict about trying to keep the first floor, especially of the main house, as it was, as she remembered it from the time she married Louis. So it's really thanks to Sally's stewardship that upon her death in 1964, there was this virtually intact treasure house record of the 19th century, of this artistic life, this global interest that Olana really represented. So upon Sally's death in 1964, there was, of course, the grassroots campaign to save Olana, led by David Huntington, who was then a professor at Smith College. Smith keeps popping up in our story, but Huntington got together this grassroots effort to pay rent to Sally's heirs, who were nephews of hers. She and Louis didn't have children, but to pay rent, stave off any sale until Olana could be designated a National Historic Landmark and made into a state historic site, be acquired by the New York State Bureau. So there are a few very famous and less famous women who were also quite involved in that effort. I just want to touch on as I wrap up here. Jacqueline Kennedy was among the most publicly profiled figures who was an active voice in the preservation of Olana. In this era, she was extremely committed to historic preservation, one of her great legacies in American politics and public life. But we have this letter here to Russell Lines, who was involved closely as a leader in the fight to save Olana, assuring him that she had spoken to her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, about getting this bill passed to preserve Olana. Audrey Bruce Currier, I also want to acknowledge, one of the co-founders of the Taconic Foundation, along with her husband, Stephen Currier. She was a major philanthropist, primarily focused on civil rights, neighborhood development, urban issues. But she and her husband made the first major gift to Olana Preservation, Inc. to sort of set the ball rolling to the saving of Olana. And finally, as we get into Olana as this open site, as this public museum, this public forum, I have to acknowledge and end us on this photo of Olana's original guides and hosts, the community members who loved this place, loved its history, and worked on the front lines to share it and raise interest in its preservation. Clearly, from its inception to the very end in creating Olana as the state historic site that we know it today, women have been in every step in that crucial central role. And I hope that this very brief tour through many of these fascinating figures helped to bring out that thread. So with that, I'll turn it back over, stop my share, turn it back over to Carolyn, and happy to answer any questions that we all have.
Thank you so much, Allegra. What a wonderful kind of travel through all of the women who have been part of this story and the kind of key players with this angle. I so appreciate it. And I think, you and I have talked at length about some of these figures and all of these maybe lesser known histories. I guess a question I'd love to start with, just to open up our dialogue, is if there are any other women or any other of their stories that might need attention, or that you'd love to kind of dive into, anything we don't know that is of interest to you, or further areas for exploration, because you never know who's in on these webinars who may be able to lend some perspective, or
so much that we don't know. But there are certainly other women who were key figures in the social life of Olana that we know a little bit less about to really build out a segment of a PowerPoint. The author Grace King comes to mind, who also, like Susan Hale, provided very colorful correspondence about her time at Olana. She was from New Orleans, but part of the Connecticut Mark Twain circle, who visited Olana. Sort of along that vein as well, Susan Warner, the wife of Charles Dudley Warner, the biographer, she was evidently a quite celebrated concert pianist, also part of the Hartford gang. And we understand that she provided the musical accompaniment to Susan Hale's theatrics at Olana. I think another thing that I would love to dive into more, encourage others to do, is looking at other women that were with the churches on their travels. Who were they encountering in these other hubs? Thinking about Mexico, those later years, there was another artist couple, the Janviers, Catherine and Janvier, who spent some time, crossed paths with them in Mexico. Certainly the women who Isabel was interacting with in Beirut and Damascus. She was particularly impressed by the home of the British expat Lady Jane Digby, who had married one of her later husbands. She had a long, very colorful personal history, but had married a Syrian Ottoman official and created this home that the churches visited. And Isabel wrote of her impressions that it was this perfect blend of East and West, something along those lines. So again, I think diving into those satellite networks would be so fascinating to reconstruct some of that history.
Well, it's just so interesting thinking about these spheres of influence and the ways in which not only, Frederic Church's own kind of spheres of influence and contacts and global travels and global experiences informed the development of Olana and the main house, the historic house, but also the ways in which Isabel's experiences may have informed that. Such an interesting question to probe and to think about. With that, we had a question come in from our own wonderful education manager, Gracie. Are there any interventions or objects on view, specifically in the house, that's tied to these women that might be a particular favorite of yours? Perhaps something for future visitors to keep an eye out for next time they visit the site or next time they visit the house?
Absolutely. Well, I think the big one is Marianne North's painting of the pelican flower from Jamaica. It is currently on view in the studio. If you peer up around the top of the studio, it's hanging next to the large Mexican painting by Andres Lopez, Sorprudenciana, near the door going out to the studio tower and porch. Really inside baseball there, but if you're keeping your eye out, Marianne North's painting is on view. I'd say the physical traces of some of these other women that we touched on were often going to be found in the library. Many of them were writers. A few years back, we did have a micro exhibition about women travel writers. Unfortunately, no longer up. Books, paper objects can only withstand being on view for so long. But definitely peer into the library if you can, see some names on the spines. And finally, I would just say, for what's always here at Olana, I mean, Isabel's influence radiates throughout the entire house, but in particular, the sitting room is really, that was her hub. That was where she ran the operations of the house. So just reframing that space as sort of the seat of Isabel's influence on Olana, I think is a really fruitful way to interpret that space. And again, think about that really formative influence of these homes she was seeing in Damascus and Beirut. I think that's most clearly shown perhaps after the court hall in the sitting room.
Fascinating. And, currently until the end of October 27th, folks will be able to come and see, as you mentioned, that wonderful
yes, Downey's quilt. Thank
piece
you.
by Downey's quilt. I think, with that, I'm curious, you in the context of this wonderful presentation, you talked a little bit about some of the creative pursuits of, the church women, the ways in which Isabel was collecting ferns, and Downey obviously partook in a kind of botanical studies of her own, the quilt making, just kind of branching off outside of our topic of the women of Olana. I'm wondering if any of the other church family members had creative pursuits that could be, something we might want to think about or look into as we kind of wrap our webinar.
That's a great question. So we're thinking, often we say that Downey was really the only of the church children who took any creative pursuit and ran with it. We could be a bit expansive. Frederic Joseph Church, the eldest living son of the Churches, was a map maker and surveyor. So that was more of his career and academic interest, but certainly had to have the draftsmanship, that kind of eye. Theodore Winthrop, the next son down, went into box and label making. So I don't know whether he was, behind the graphic design element at all. That could be something to look into. But I've always seen Theodore showing up in the record as more of like the practical-minded business child. And then Lewis, I would say, more than anything, was an outdoorsman. But I'm remembering now, you've jogged my memory, Lewis was a photographer. We do have photographs that Lewis took in the Olana collection. Many of them are the sort of hunting photos, posing with the dead moose. But he did experiment with photography. And that could certainly be something. I mean, thinking of the fabulous collection of 19th century travel photography that is in the archives at Olana, definitely an interest that came out of this artistic upbringing that he shared with Downey and his brothers.
And so fascinating to think about the ways in which that, being raised within the context of that artistic upbringing kind of falls along this gendered line in the 19th century. I mean, thank you so much for highlighting that and thinking about the ways some of these fabulous and fascinating female figures kind of subverted that or worked within it, and all did so while making a pit stop at Olana. So thank you, Allegra. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. We, if anyone has any remaining questions, but I think we're so filled with knowledge and more questions to explore and more areas for research. So thank you, Allegra.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.